Thanks very much, Melina. That was a very generous introduction. I was a bit embarrassed sitting in front and listening about myself. Welcome, everyone. I hope you're not feeling too sleepy after your lunch. And my talk is going to be about 25 minutes. That's what I planned for. And I wanted to thank Joe for inviting me to speak at this conference. And I hope that you're having a great time at the conference. So without any further ado, my plan today is to talk about mainly the intersections between education, conflict, and peace. And then try to present to you a conceptual framework that is, I think, helpful in analyzing how violent conflicts or conditions that drive violent conflicts and education and peace intersect. So I would be presenting you with the framework towards the end, but I would begin with some of the case studies, the context where I have engaged through my academic work. And then I will also present to you some of the tensions around working in the context of conflict and protracted crisis. So we hope that we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So if we look at the sort of big picture here, so globally we have a real crisis in education. There's also, of course, humanitarian crisis because of violent conflicts, but real crisis in education. The highest number of conflicts since World War II. That's the day that we live in. 56 violent conflicts around the world today, and these are increasingly internationalized, where about 92 different countries are involved in conflicts outside their national borders. Consequently, a huge number of children are affected by violence, displacement, and protracted situations. So more than 1 in 6 children globally now live in conflicts and crisis settings, and 70 million are out of school. Those who are in school are not achieving the minimum level of literacy and numeracy. So we have a real crisis of learning in these situations. And the percentage of the world's children living in conflict has doubled as compared to 1990s, as compared with today. So there's a real crisis in research, educational research as well. So there's a chronic lack of research evidence around how children in conflict crisis learn and they develop, and what are the kinds of educational approaches, programs, and policies are likely to contribute to enhance their well-being or educational outcomes in the settings that they live in. There are also usually the problems are around how educational programs are designed. For example, low education outcomes are often explained in terms of cost-effective technical solutions. The idea is that if we designed cost-effective technical educational interventions, then we would be able to address the educational problems that children face in these contexts, which actually undermines the complexity of educational processes in these settings, which is the politics of education, as Susan Robertson and Roger Dale call. We often talk about educational politics, what happens within schools, resource allocation, classrooms management, exams and assessment and financing and so forth. But the bigger questions around how educational decisions are made, who is involved in that process, who decides the language of instruction, how teaching workforce is recruited, what kind of communities have access to education, which groups are excluded from the opportunity to access education, and which kind of communities are marginalized in the national or international economic, political, and social processes. These are very complex issues which are not often dealt with or not engaged with in research. As a result, the technical solutions often fail or do not produce the kinds of outcomes that are intended. And then often research agenda is set by the donor agencies or international actors and organizations. And there's very limited engagement with the local stakeholders in setting the research agenda in the first place. So local stakeholders are often brought into the dialogue only at the stage of dissemination. And there's a real problem of ownership of the knowledge that is produced through research, as well as knowledge being disconnected from the kinds of problems that local education actors are tackling. And then finally, most of the research that we find in conflict and crisis context on education looks into problem analysis, right? So analyzing the kinds of challenges that educational communities face, which is important, but there's lack of research around the kinds of innovative practices, the kinds of policies and programs that have contributed to change the situation of crisis in these settings. So I'm involved in a large-scale research program called Education Research in Conflict and Protracted Crises, as Melina introduced at the start. You might want to just take the QR capture, whatever that might call. So it takes you to the web page where we've published a number of research outputs through studies in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Nigeria, South Sudan, Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, and Myanmar. So then if we look at, I'm beginning to sort of problematize this whole field of education and conflict, as I call. From looking at education from conflict perspective, we need to try to understand the intersections between society and educational processes, rather than looking at education in the sense that looking at formal education or schools. So if one comes from outside the educational discipline, if you like, it's very easy to think about education in the form of like a school or children or teachers. But there's a bigger domain of education where education intersects with economy, politics, culture, and most importantly, the history within which education is designed. The systems are designed. And often education is perceived as a positive force for societal change and human flourishing. Education is better, more education is better for progress and prosperity. So that's the kind of sort of dominant understanding in society. What is not recognized or not sort of engaged with is this idea of negative face of education, the way that education fuels conflict drivers and education can become a problem in societies. Yet this is what I will try to unpack in my presentation. But of course, education is a form of societal good, and it addresses a number of challenges that human society faces relating to economy, politics, democratization, of course, and promoting peace and social justice, and so forth. So that's also one of the components that I will talk about. So let's talk about the first concept, where I call education as a victim of conflict. Yeah, so the victim. Let me present to you a case study of conflict situation in Nigeria. Is anyone from Nigeria here? No. But I'm sure you've heard about schools being targeted for violent attack in northern Nigeria, mostly because they teach the subjects that the militant group Boko Haram does not accept. For example, teaching maths, English, and modern subjects. And I'm sure you heard about these Chibok girls. The girls were, from schools abducted by Boko Haram in 2014, and there was a massive sort of media coverage around the world. But even though that was a major incident that happened, abduction of girls and attacks on schools haven't really stopped, so that it continues. More than 780 children were abducted for ransom in 2021, for example. And schools remain closed in many parts of northern Nigeria, and hundreds of school classrooms have been destroyed. And it was estimated in 2019 that 2.8 million children were needing education in emergencies. And that actually puts Nigeria on top of the list with a high number of out-of-school children. 60% of the over 10 million out-of children are girls, and mostly they're from northern Nigeria. And schools are also occupied for military purposes. When the armed forces are deployed to tackle the security situation, then schools are often used as shelters. And then girls' enrollment is declining because parents feel that they are not secure traveling to school and from school, and they usually get married at an early age. And there's an organization called a coalition, if you like, it's a global coalition for protecting education from attack, which publishes an annual report that documents violent attacks on universities, schools, teachers, and students from around the world. In 2022, around 5,000 attacks on education were recorded, but also a lot of sort of use of schools and universities by the military was reported. And physical attacks or threats of attacks on schools, students, and teachers is quite widespread. The military use of schools in various conflict-affected contexts doubled in 21-22. But then what is the reason behind attacking education in these contexts? One of the reasons is that schools or educational institutions represent state authority. If there is a militant organization that is resisting the state authority, then the schools that are available across the country or the territory get targeted in order to undermine the authority of the state. But there may be like revolutionary sort of de facto states. For example, in Myanmar, in Karen and Karenni states of Myanmar, the military junta often attacks these schools because these schools are managed by the revolutionary groups that resist the central authority in Yangon. So also, attack on education serves as a propaganda tool, because attacking schools and children hits the core of that society. It really sort of destabilizes the sense of security and well-being of the community. So that actually serves as the propaganda tool for the militant groups. But also in many contexts, education is rejected because some of the oppositional groups see the educational processes as a form of repression on their language, and culture, history, or religion, as the case that I presented on Nigeria. But also there's forced recruitment of children and teachers or young people from schools, and therefore militant groups tend to attack these institutions. Also, a lot of security forces tend to utilize education as a vehicle for achieving their security goals. As a result, schools and educational spaces are attacked or interfered or are dominated for various purposes. Now, that was the education as a victim, right? The second concept I want to present to you is the concept of education as perpetrator, how education fuels violent conflict or it creates conditions for violent conflict. And here I want to present to you the case study of Nepal, where the Maoist rebellion began in 1996 and it ended in 2006 after the peace agreement. So historically in Nepal, education has been restricted mostly to the ruling class, and mostly the high caste elite groups have had control over education policies, language of instruction, and the curricular contents. And Nepal is a diverse, ethnically and linguistically diverse country, but one dominant ethnic group controls power and therefore the educational processes, policies, contents, etc. So the state actually adopted this process of assimilation. Yeah, so Nepali language as the national language, everybody had to follow as the language of instruction in school, and the history was very much dominated by the glorification of the dominant ethnic and caste communities, and the diverse cultural practices and linguistic communities were undermined, and then they were systematically excluded from the processes of nation building. And there was also glorified military history, and which actually obscured or demonized the history of certain cultural groups. Children from low caste and ethnic minority communities, as a result, were underachieving in education. So, there was a lot of discontent among diverse ethnic minorities and indigenous groups. So the Maoist revolution was launched in 1996, and all of these grievances that these communities had were actually capitalized on in order to mobilize the masses, in an armed rebellion, which actually cost the lives of about 17,000 people before the peace agreement was signed in 2006. So the way that education reproduces these inequalities and fuels grievances, and these are some of the kind of evidence that we find across various research across various contexts. So the example that I gave is about this cultural assimilation through language and curriculum and policies. Segregated education, when education is divided, then it tends to produce divided communities. For example, in Northern Ireland, some colleagues who are from this part of the world might know that education has been hugely divided, and only about 7% children go to integrated schools. And so that these divided schools actually, there's little appetite among sort of political groups to address this problem of educational divisions, which actually creates divisions in society, because these become the sources of political support for these contesting political groups. And there's a lot of research on the way that Ukrainian textbooks promoted nationalism, but also the way that Russian textbooks promoted, a narrative of, hegemony and superiority, and undermining other neighboring identities or countries, if you like. So history is another problem. The way the history is written, often it manipulates social realities. So my colleague Marilal has written about how India and Pakistan have been educating their young people through this very divided historical narratives. And then there's a lot of evidence from other contexts as well. Mother tongue instruction, I think that also serves as a grievance when it is undermined and repressed through education policy. So as a result, education actually perpetrates symbolic violence on communities by repressing their language, which actually reflects their identity and their very existence, if you like. Then also formal education is often seen as sort of fueling those grievances. Now, the third concept I want to talk about is education as liberation, right? And here I want to talk about the case of Colombia, where I've done some research that Colombia has one of the longest running violent conflict. But after 2017, I think the country seems to have moved towards sort of peace negotiation, peace process, and some sort of social transformation. But the huge problems exist in the country in relation to the dominance of neoliberal economic policies, land grabbing, multinational companies coming in and sort of violating sort of indigenous ways of living. But within communities, people organize themselves to challenge some of these sort of violations that they have experienced in their villages and in their towns. And they have a tradition of this participatory action research, where communities engage in discussing the kinds of problems that they have experienced, and also trying to build solidarity and a form of resistance and mass mobilization. And what we saw through our research is a lot of indigenous knowledge was brought into action in challenging the kinds of injustices. So here, education, not in the sense the way it was happening in state-controlled educational institutions, but more in public spaces and in communities. People were learning from each other. They were looking at the kinds of ecological, economic, political, human rights related problems and trying to understand and learn from each other and build that social consciousness and solidarity to resist the kinds of inequalities and injustices they had experienced. And this actually speaks to a lot of work that the critical scholars have produced historically. Paulo Freire, coined this term critical consciousness, education, popular education, promoting this idea of critical consciousness where people understand their social, environmental, economic, and political positionalities, and they develop their agency to resist and to enable social change. And other scholars have also written about that. So the point that I'm making here is that education is also a vehicle for liberation of social justice and social transformation. And the fourth concept, I call this as education as peace building. That's something that we truly believe in. And one of the examples that I have often come across is the World War II history and the events in Northeast Asia, Korea, China, and Japan. So this is a real sort of problematic history relating to World War II in these countries, particularly in relation to Japan's invasion on China and the narratives around, huge number of soldiers being killed, but also civilians particularly being killed and women being raped. And the use of this Korean comfort women that actually carried on for decades, and how the Japanese Imperial Army treated some of these women. It actually is a very uncomfortable historical reality, which is often taught and presented with different messages in different countries. And then what happened, really interesting thing around this, the common history textbook in Northeast Asia, that when Japanese government endorsed history textbooks, at some point, the teachers were actually unhappy about the way that the historical facts were presented. And Japanese teachers refused to teach, and there was a lot of tensions in the education sector following this textbook. And China and Korea protested because the narratives that were being promoted in the textbooks were, basically obscuring or silencing the kinds of historical events that had happened. So there was a project which was called this Common History Textbook Initiative, where a collaborative work that actually brought together 50 Chinese, Japanese, and South Korean scholars to work on this textbook, which could actually provide more balanced approach to historical narratives. Most importantly, presenting the kinds of historical facts, but also enabling learners to interpret and to understand those facts from different perspectives. And it was intended for middle school students in each country. But of course, the impact of that kind of initiative that you would imagine would be very difficult to measure, but also inevitably that it would be quite, not very comfortable for the political authorities to recognize and promote the kind of historical narratives that would undermine their, national glory or something. I think teaching about slavery, teaching about the British Empire in British schools is equally uncomfortable, right? So I think it's equally true. But the textbook initiative was actually intended to actually promote this recognition of different narratives, different historical narratives. I think as a whole, I think education can contribute to peace building through improvement in access, for example, maximizing access to education for marginalized communities. Schools can actually promote, peace by putting pressure on the political authorities to respect educational spaces as zones of peace, for example. We saw that enormously in Nepal, which had a lot of impact. And education can, of course, promote social cohesion, human rights, civic identity, and most importantly, post-war reconciliation. And we know the human capital theory, where education contributes to improve, livelihoods, economic regeneration, rebuilding, society, and promote economic growth, and through which it can contribute broadly to transform societies. Now, through that understanding, which I call this VPLP framework, that education needs to be analyzed, in a sort of multi-directional way, that education is not always a vehicle for peace and social justice, and it needs to be examined more critically. So what is important is to recognize that education, conflict, and peace intersect in complex ways. And more education is not necessarily the better if it is actually fueling conflict drivers. And this framework, I think, enables us to really understand that complexity. And the key mission here, I would argue, is how to actually transform education from being victim and perpetrator to more kind of liberator and peace builder. This may sound like a very simple analytical framework, but this sits within this very complex sort of conflict environment that we face today. And I actually call that as some very uncomfortable situation that we live in today, the way that the conflict in Ukraine, the devastation in Gaza, and brutality that is happening in the Middle East that is going on, and also the US administration's policy and so forth that we've observed. One of the biggest challenges that we face in our field is the way that societies are framed as conflict affected. as if there is no perpetrator. It's like more kind of pandemic affected or disease affected, right? So there is a perpetrator. There are powerful oppressors involved in this in this brutality and then grievances that people are experiencing. And also framing conflict as an endogenous problem, the problem of that particular context, silences the complicity of colonialism and geopolitical dynamics, and also the vested interest of the powerful nations in that process, and of course the authoritarianism that we observe in many places. But then also there is problem of securitization of education aid. So how aid is actually used to achieve military goals or security goals, national security of the donor countries. I think that's hugely sort of problematic and unethical. My colleague Mario Novelli has done some work in that area. The other challenge and biggest irony for us, I think, in our field is that the way that Western governments are supplying arms and funding wars, and then at the same time supporting humanitarian action. And, on the one hand, you got this complicity in that brutality, and then you got this supposedly kind of, charitable and kind-hearted gesture of humanitarian aid or sort of charitable aid, using the same taxpayers' money, if you like. And then this is basically also humanitarian hypocrisy, that some settings which have experienced devastation are ignored, and there is complicity, whereas other contexts are prioritized or seen as more urgent, which has a real sort of hypocrisy embedded in the way that it is acted on. And then also this has really sort of divided communities, on the one, scholarly communities. On the one hand, you got this, critical community that constantly challenges, and there's a lot of activism against the way that Western countries have been complicit in perpetuation of violent conflicts. But then you've got the scholarly community that actually works in finding solutions to the problems that are framed as more local and context specific, and completely disconnecting those problems from the legacies that I was mentioning earlier. And I think it's a difficult task. I think it's easier to stay in silos, either to stay in critical space and constantly raise questions and challenge, or to work with the power, circle and try to produce research evidence, for example, in the universities. But coming together actually creates a lot of tensions. And this is something that through the ERIC research that I was talking about, that we, I have tried to do, having worked as a critical scholar for over a decade. And then also there are questions around ethics of conducting research in conflict and crisis settings, right? And knowledge extraction, data extraction, and how universities and researchers are serving their own goals through the research in some of the brutal spaces. People are suffering, and there's enormous sort of data collection happening, and people are not being fed back in order to change the conditions that they live in. So I think this is another sort of serious issue, and also the way that research agenda is set, and funding and prioritization happens. So the point that I'm trying to make here is we are all implicated in this process, this way or the other. And I think being part of in academia and researching in conflict and crisis settings also implicates people like ourselves in this horrible war situations that we have experienced today. And in this process, I think Michael Rothberg's work is very helpful, which is called the implicated subject that he talks about. And then I wanted to just use this quote that my colleagues have used in their recent publication, that the concept of the implicated subject moves away from legalistic definitions of the perpetrators of violence and instead opens up a pathway for reflecting on how our silence, acquiescence, complicity, and embeddedness in networks of power and privilege might contribute to and benefit from processes of violence. It also allows us to reflect on the way institutions, including fields of research and practice, might connect to these systems of oppression in complex and often unintended ways. Ultimately, it also seeks to find a pathway whereby political and social responsibility leads to collective action to redress injustices and move the struggle for social justice forward. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid we only have 1 minute for perhaps one question.
I'm so sorry about that.
Please be brief with your question.
Thank you very much. It was very insightful. What are your views on cultural genocide? Because the context of how the belligerent occupies, like it happened in the World War II and subsequently. So there is a whole issue of cultural genocide where you say, yes, education is there, but it's a form of indoctrination by the occupying power. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think if I think about the framework that I just presented, I think the cultural genocide is the way that education is used as an instrument for perpetration of violence. So the way that indigenous cultures and languages have been appropriated or belittled and have been presented as underdeveloped, primitive, and therefore they need to be assimilated along the lines of the culture, epistemology, practices, political systems of the authorities, is the way that education is implicated in that process, right? But education is not everything, right? But obviously politics governs the educational processes, but education in that process is used for that. I mean, we've got the history of colonialism, where the indigenous cultures and languages were systematically repressed and eliminated in the name of civilization, right? So I would see that from educational perspective. I think it's a component of that perpetration of violence where education is implicated.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks very much for listening. And I wasn't warned, so I think I just carried away. But thanks very much for bearing with me. And I would be very happy to be contacted for the dialogue and discussion if anyone is interested. Thank you.